The duel had stretched past 30 minutes, and both combatants moved like they were fighting through water. Their bodies pushed beyond the limits that biology had set for them. Carveth's natural regeneration was working against the nerve damage Yuna had inflicted, and feeling was slowly returning to his right arms, though they still responded slower than they should. His scales were scratched and dented in places that had never been touched in combat before, and the taste of his own blood in his mouth was utterly foreign to a being who had never faced anyone capable of making him bleed. Yuna operated on something beyond physical strength, her muscles screaming and her ribs grinding, and her vision blurred by the blood that kept dripping from her forehead into her eyes. She had passed the point of exhaustion long ago, and now ran on pure determination. The same force that had carried her ancestors across ice ages and famines and wars that should have ended them 1,000 times over. The crowd had stopped murmuring, and the professors had stopped taking notes, and even the medical teams had stopped checking their instruments. Everyone watched in complete silence as two beings who should have been finished continued to fight because neither one knew how to stop. Carveth made his final offensive with all four arms working together despite the pain it cost him, channeling every technique his people had developed over millions of years of predatory evolution. His staff swept and thrust and spun in patterns designed to overwhelm any defense, and his claws extended to add deadly edges to strikes that were already devastating. Yuna met the assault without retreating, her simple human staff moving in desperate arcs that blocked what she could and deflected what she could. Not they traded blows that would have ended the fight minutes ago if either had any energy left to finish it. Carveth's staff connected with Yuna's shoulder with a crack that echoed across the arena, and the force spun her around like a toy. She did not fall. She moved with the impact instead of against it, using the momentum of the spin to add power to a counter-strike that she could never have generated on her own. Her staff caught Carveth across the jaw, hitting the one spot on a Varak's skull that evolution had not reinforced with bone ridges. The blow snapped his head to the side and sent stars exploding across his vision. Before he could recover, she struck again. Then again, each hit landing on joints or nerve clusters or the soft tissues around his eyes. She could not match his strength. She never could have matched his strength, but in that moment she matched his will. And that was enough. Carveth fell to one knee with a sound like a mountain crumbling, and his staff slipped from fingers that no longer had the strength to hold it. The referee moved forward to intervene and declare the match over due to the Varak's inability to continue. Carveth raised one hand before the words could be spoken. He yielded. The sound that erupted from the crowd defied description. A wave of shock and disbelief, and something that might have been triumph from the lower-tier students, who had never dared to imagine this moment. A Tier 1 apex predator had submitted to a Tier 7 human in front of the entire galaxy. Tessith screamed with joy, and her bioluminescence exploded in colors that no one had ever seen a Mallory produce before. Dorvan pounded his thick fists against the railing, and Whisper's membrane skin blazed with gold and white and pure brilliant silver. Yuna stood swaying in the center of the arena for exactly 3 seconds after Carveth's submission. Then her legs gave out, and the medical team rushed forward to catch her before she hit the ground. She spent 3 days in the regeneration ward with machines working constantly to repair the damage she had sustained, and the doctors said it was a miracle she had survived long enough to win, let alone remain standing for the entire duel. When she finally woke, Tessith was there, sitting in a chair that she had clearly not left for some time, and her skin glowed with soft, happy blues that made the recovery room feel warmer than it was. Dorvan and Whisper arrived within minutes of hearing she was conscious, and they brought food from the dining hall that was considerably better than the medical nutrition paced. They told her what had happened in the days since the duel, while the galaxy watched recordings of the fight that had been viewed more times than any event in Academy history. The tier system was being questioned by beings who had never challenged it before, and lower-tier students across the galaxy were asking why they should accept classifications that had been assigned by species who had never seen them fight for. Their survival humans were being discussed in terms that did not include the word fragile for the first time since first contact, and the Varax ambassador had withdrawn his formal protest and returned to his ways. Homeworld, without comment on the fourth day, Carveth came to see her. He entered the recovery room alone, without his ceremonial armor or his weapons, and he stood at the foot of her bed, looking at the small human who had done what no one had ever done to him before. He did not apologize for the duel because his people did not apologize for honorable combat, and he said clearly that he still believed the Varax were the superior species in most measurable ways, but he admitted that he understood something now that he had not understood before. He asked her what humans called the thing that had refused to let her stay down when her body had failed and her strength had run out, and every rational assessment said she should have surrendered. Yuna thought about the question for a long moment. She said they called it spite sometimes, the stubborn refusal to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you quit. They called it hope other times, the belief that things could be different if you just held on long enough. Mostly they just called it being human. Carveth nodded slowly and left without another word, but Yuna noticed that he nodded to her as an equal before he walked through the door. She returned to classes the following week, walking slowly but walking on her own feet. The other students looked at her differently now, and not just the lower-tier species who saw her as a symbol of what they might become. Even the Tier 1 students stepped aside when she passed, not out of fear but out of something closer to respect. Tessith walked beside her everywhere she went, her bioluminescence bright with happiness that never seemed to fade. Dorvan and Whisper had become permanent fixtures in her life, and the four of them sat together in the dining hall at a table that was no longer empty. Carveth nodded to her when they passed in the corridors, and she nodded back, and that was enough. Somewhere in the Galactic archives, a Tier 7 classification was being reviewed, and the beings responsible for maintaining the system were struggling to update their understanding of what humans were capable of. They would learn eventually what Yuna had always known. The size of the fight did not matter nearly as much as the size of the heart inside the fighter, and human hearts were bigger than anyone had ever guessed. Carveth stumbled back with his right arms hanging useless at his sides, and his golden eyes stared at the human girl with an expression that had never crossed his face in any previous duel. He was shocked. He was confused. He was feeling something that his species rarely experienced in combat, something that went against every instinct his ancestors had developed over millions of years of predatory dominance. He was uncertain Yuna stood her ground despite the cost of her successful attack, and that cost was written in the way she held her left arm close to her body and the careful, shallow breaths she took to avoid aggravating the ribs that had cracked when she moved inside his strike. The blow she had dodged had still grazed her, and the force that would have killed her if it had landed clean had still been enough to do serious damage. The medical team signaled the referee with urgent gestures, their instruments showing that the human combatant had sustained injuries that warranted intervention under standard safety protocols. The referee called for a brief halt and asked Yuna directly if she wished to yield. Given the extent of her injuries, her voice was steady when she said no. The referee looked at the medical team, then at the Academy Chancellor, then at the human girl who stood bleeding and broken, but utterly refusing to fall. The duel continued. Carveth shook his right arms, trying to restore feeling to the deadened nerves. And a cold anger began to replace the shock as he realized what had happened. A Tier 7 human had wounded a Tier 1 Varax. And the entire galaxy was watching. His father would hear about this, and his clan would hear about this. And every being who had ever feared the Varax would see that their apex predators could be hurt by the lowest of the low. He attacked with his 2 functioning arms, sacrificing the elegant forearm techniques of his people for raw, brutal power that needed only 2 limbs to crush a fragile human body. Yuna dodged and deflected and took hits that she could not avoid, her staff moving in patterns that Dorvan recognized from his analysis of her training sessions. She was not trying to overpower him because that was impossible. She was not trying to outlast him because her injuries made that unlikely. She was targeting the specific points she had identified in her research, the joints and nerve clusters and soft tissues that evolution had left vulnerable even on the mightiest predator. A strike to the back of his knee made him stumble. A jab to the soft skin beneath his jaw made him flinch. A sweeping blow to the inside of his elbow sent pain shooting up his arm and made his grip on his staff falter for just a moment. She fought like a creature who knew exactly how fragile she was and had made peace with that fragility long ago. Carveth felt something stirring in his memory. Old records he had studied as a young warrior, learning the history of his people. The Varax had encountered many species during their rise to dominance, and they had hunted most of them to extinction or submission without difficulty. But there had been one species they had learned to avoid, a species from a death world at the edge of explored space, who had looked weak and soft and easy to kill. The first Varax hunting party that had landed on Earth had never returned. The second party had sent a single survivor back with a warning that the creatures on this world did not know how to surrender. They had been classified as too dangerous to hunt despite their lack of natural weapons or armor, and the Varax had moved on to easier prey. Carveth understood now what that ancient warning had meant. Humans had not evolved to be apex predators. They had evolved to kill apex predators. Every advantage his species had developed, the strength and the speed and the armor and the claws, humans had developed strategies to defeat. They had hunted creatures bigger than themselves, stronger than themselves, faster than themselves, and they had done it with nothing. The patience and persistence and the absolute refusal to accept that they could not win. Yuna caught him across the face with a strike that split his lip and sent dark blood dripping down his chin. She was smaller and weaker and badly injured, but she kept coming, as if her body had not received the message that it should have fallen long ago. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the duel passed 20 minutes and showed no signs of ending. Professors who had taught for centuries exchanged glances that said they had never seen anything like this, and students who had grown up believing in the natural order of the tier system felt something shifting in their understanding of the galaxy. Carveth landed a blow that sent Yuna sprawling across the arena floor, and she lay motionless as the referee began the standard count that would end the duel if she could not rise. 1, 2, 3. Tessith buried her face in Dorvan's shoulder, unable to watch. 4, 5, 6. Whisper's membrane skin flickered with grays and whites that showed despair. 7, 8. Yuna stood up. Her nose was bleeding, and one eye was swelling shut, and she held her staff in hands that trembled with exhaustion. But she was standing. She raised her weapon and told the referee she was ready to continue. Something cracked in Carveth then, something deeper than bone or muscle. He looked at this small human who should have been broken a dozen times over and saw something that his species had forgotten how to recognize. He saw someone who simply did not know how to quit. His voice echoed across the silent arena when he spoke for the first time since the duel began. He asked her why she would not stay down. Yuna smiled through bloody teeth and gave him an answer that would be remembered for Generations, she said the humans never learned how. The dueling arena had not seen a crowd this large in over 50 years, and every seat was filled with beings who had come to witness what they believed would be the fastest and most one-sided match in Academy history students, pressed against the railings of the upper levels while professors claimed the reserved sections near the front, and even diplomatic observers from a dozen species had requested permission to attend this unprecedented event. The Academy Chancellor stood at the central podium, looking deeply uncomfortable with all the attention, and she reviewed the rules with a voice that carried across the massive space through hidden speakers. Duels were fought until submission or unconsciousness or intervention by the referee, and lethal force was officially prohibited, though accidents happened with alarming frequency. When Tier 1 species were involved, medical teams waited at the edges of the arena with equipment designed to treat injuries ranging from minor cuts to catastrophic organ damage, and several of them had already placed quiet bets on how quickly the human would fall. Carveth Sorn entered first through the eastern gate, and the crowd greeted him with a respectful silence that acknowledged his power and his position. His scales had been polished with ceremonial oil that made them gleam under the arena lights, and the traditional Varax fighting staff in his four hands looked like it had been designed to break mountains apart. He moved to the center of the arena and stood motionless, his golden eyes fixed on the western gate where his opponent would emerge. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and then the western gate opened. Yuna Park walked into the arena looking impossibly small against the vast empty space around her, and she wore the standard Academy combat attire that hung on her frame like it had been made for someone else entirely. Her staff was a simple human design without ornamentation or advanced materials, and she carried it in both hands as she made her way toward the center where the Varax waited. Whispers rippled through the crowd as beings leaned toward each other to comment on the obvious mismatch, and more than a few expressed sympathy for the girl who had thrown her life away for a moment of pride. In the lower sections near the medical teams, Tessith sat with Dorvan and Whisper, and her bioluminescent skin cycled through anxious colors so rapidly that the beings beside her had to look away. The Chancellor announced the combatants and confirmed that both had entered willingly under Article 12 of Academy Law, and she asked each of them one final time if they wished to withdraw. Carveth said nothing, his silence carrying more contempt than words ever could. Yuna said she was ready, and her voice did not shake. The referee took position at the edge of the combat zone and raised one hand, then brought it down with a sharp motion that signaled the duel had begun. Carveth did not attack immediately, choosing instead to circle the human girl with slow, deliberate steps that showed off the reach of his forearms. He expected her to freeze as most opponents did when faced with a Varax at close range. The ancient prey response that had served his species well for millions of years. Yuna did not freeze. She mirrored his movement and kept her staff raised between them, her eyes tracking every shift of his weight and every twitch of his claws. The crowd grew quiet again as the circling continued, confused by a human who was not behaving the way humans were supposed to behave. Carveth grew impatient and lunged forward with blinding speed, his upper arms sweeping toward her head, while his lower arms aimed for her legs in a classic Varax capture strike. Yuna threw herself sideways and rolled under the attack, coming up 3 meters away with her staff still raised, and her breathing only slightly faster than before. The crowd gasped as beings realized the human had just dodged an apex predator's opening assault. Carveth turned and struck again, then again, then again, each attack faster and more vicious than the last as frustration began to color his movements. Yuna deflected what she could and dodged what she could not, taking glancing blows that would leave bruises but avoiding the crushing strikes that would have ended the fight instantly. One claw caught her across the forehead and opened a cut. That sent blood streaming down her face, and she wiped it from her eyes without slowing down or showing any sign of surrender. The duel stretched past 5 minutes, then past 7, then past 10. Carveth's attacks grew less precise as something unexpected began to happen. Something that had never happened to him in any of his previous victories. He was getting tired. The Varax had evolved for short, explosive hunts, where prey was caught and killed within moments, and their bodies were not designed for extended physical exertion. He had never needed endurance before because no opponent had ever lasted long enough to test it. Yuna was bruised and bleeding and clearly in pain, but she kept moving with a persistence that seemed almost mechanical in its refusal to stop. She watched him with eyes that were learning his patterns, cataloging the way he shifted his weight before each strike and the small tells that revealed which arms would attack next. At 12 minutes, the crowd had fallen completely silent, and even the professors were leaning forward in their seats with expressions of disbelief. This was not how the duel was supposed to go. Dorvan clutched the railing with his thick crest fingers and whispered that she was doing it, that she was actually surviving. And Tessa's skin blazed with hopeful gold. Carveth roared with frustration and committed to a massive overhead strike that would crush the human girl with all the force his four arms could generate. It was the kind of attack that ended fights through sheer power. Impossible to block and devastating to anything it touched. Yuna did not try to block it. She stepped forward instead of back, moving inside the arc of the blow before it could build full momentum. Her staff struck 3 times in rapid succession against nerve clusters she had memorized from medical diagrams. And Carveth felt his right arms go numb from shoulder to claw. He stumbled backward with something like shock on his face, staring at the human who had just done what no opponent had ever done before. She had heard him. She had actually heard him. The arena fell so silent that the only sound was Yuna's steady breathing and the drip of blood from her forehead. To the metal floor, Carveth looked at his useless right arms, then looked at the small human girl who stood before him with her bloody face and her simple staff, and her eyes that held no fear at all. Something cold settled in his chest, something that felt horribly like doubt. The duel was not over, and for the first time in his life, the Varax was not certain how it would end. News of the challenge spread through the Galactic Unified Academy like fire through dry grass, and by morning there was not a single being on the station who had not heard about the human girl who had lost her mind. Yuna walked through corridors filled with whispers and stares, and she heard fragments of conversations that stopped the moment she came near. Some called her brave in tones that suggested they meant stupid, while others shook their heads and spoke about the waste of a young life, cut short by foolish pride. 3 professors visited her quarters on the first day to strongly advise withdrawal from the duel, explaining that there was no shame in admitting a mistake and that social embarrassment was far preferable to death. The Academy Chancellor sent a formal message reminding her that withdrawal was permitted at any time before the duel began, and the message contained detailed statistics about injury rates in cross-tier combat that were clearly meant to frighten her into changing her mind. Yuna read every message and listened to every warning, then deleted them all and began to plan. The galaxy had classified humans as Tier 7, the lowest ranking for any sentient species, and the classification reports described them as fragile and short-lived and possessing no remarkable physical traits. What the reports failed to mention was that humans had clawed their way to dominance on a planet that had tried to kill them every single day for millions of years. They had hunted mammoths and saber-toothed cats and bears that towered over them, and they had done it with nothing but sharp sticks in the absolute refusal to give up. Yuna accessed the Academy archives and began researching everything she could find about the Varax species. she learned that they had evolved as apex predators on a heavy gravity world, developing 4 arms and armored scales and incredible strength that made them nearly unbeatable in direct combat. Their hunting style relied on short, explosive bursts of speed and power, overwhelming prey before it could escape or fight back. And most of their kills were finished in less than a minute. What interested Yuna most was what she found in the medical research sections. Detailed charts of Varak's physiology that showed nerve clusters and joint weaknesses and the soft tissues around their sensory organs. Their armor was not complete, and a student who knew where to strike could cause real damage, even without matching their strength. The elite combat training halls refused her entry when she tried to reserve practice time, citing her low-tier classification and the need to protect advanced equipment from inexperienced users. She found the lower gymnasium instead, a forgotten space in the station's maintenance section where broken training dummies collected dust and the lighting flickered with age. It would have to be enough. On the second day, Tessith found her there, sweating and bruised from hours of practice against the damaged equipment. Mallory's skin glowed with worried oranges and pinks as she watched Yuna strike the same points over and over until her hands ached. Tessith said she wanted to help, though she admitted she had no combat training and did not know what she could offer. Yuna smiled and said that company was worth more than she knew. By the third day, 2 more students had joined them in the lower gymnasium, drawn by curiosity or guilt or something else that Yuna could not quite name. Dorvan was a Kreth, an aquatic species with tough leathery skin and engineering minds that could analyze any system and find its flaws. And he offered to study Karvith's recorded duels to identify patterns in his fighting style. Whisper was a Silith who communicated through color changes in her membrane skin rather than speech, and she had medical training that would be needed when Yuna inevitably took damage in the arena. None of them believed she could win, but all of them believed she should not have to fight alone. On the 4th day, the Varak's ambassador filed a formal protest with the Academy Council, calling the duel an insult to his species and demanding it be cancelled for the protection of galactic dignity. The protest was denied under Article 12, which made no exceptions for hurt feelings or wounded pride, and the ambassador's fury made headlines across 3 star systems. Karvith trained in the elite combat halls with equipment that cost more than most ships, and recording drones captured his sessions for students who wanted to study proper Tier 1 techniques. His father contacted him through a secure channel, his massive face filling the holographic display with displeasure and disappointment. The High Warlord demanded to know why his son had accepted a challenge from a worthless species that should have been beneath his notice, and his voice carried the weight of generations of Varak's warriors who had never lowered themselves to fight the weak. Karvith promised that he would make an example of the human that would remind the entire galaxy why his people were feared, and his claws extended as he spoke with an eagerness that made his scales darken with anticipation. His father approved and ended the communication, leaving Karvith alone with his thoughts and his absolute certainty that the duel would last less than 30 seconds. On the 5th day, Dorvan presented his analysis of 17 recorded Karvith victories, and the patterns he found were both encouraging and terrifying. The Varaks relied heavily on intimidation, using his size and reputation to break opponents before the first strike was ever thrown. And most of his duels ended with surrender rather than actual combat. When he did fight, he attacked with overwhelming force in the opening moments, expecting to end things quickly and decisively. He had never faced an opponent who survived that initial assault, and there was no data on how he performed when a fight stretched beyond the first few minutes. Yuna listened carefully and thanked Dorvan for his work, then returned to her practice with new focus on evasion and endurance. On the 6th day, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that exhaustion would kill her faster than any Varak's claw. She sat on the observation deck and watched ships pass against the backdrop of stars. And she thought about everyone who had ever told her that humans were not meant for the wider galaxy. Tessith found her there as the station's artificial day cycled dim toward night. And the Mallory sat beside her in comfortable silence for a long while. Finally, Tessith asked if Una was afraid. And her skin flickered with blues and greens that showed how much the answer mattered to her. Una admitted that she was terrified, that her hands shook when she thought about facing those 4 arms and those golden eyes, and that she had never been more scared of anything in her entire life. Tessith asked why she was still going through with the challenge. If she knew how frightened she was, Una thought about her grandmother again, about the stories she had told of surviving horrors that should have broken anyone. And she remembered the old words that had been passed down through generations of park women who refused to quit. She said that on Earth there was an old saying, that courage was not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. And that being afraid only meant you understood what you were facing. She went to her quarters and slept for 4 hours and dreamed of nothing at all. When she woke on the 7th day, the day of the duel, she dressed in her combat attire and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw a small human girl with dark eyes and steady hands. A Tier 7 species that the galaxy had dismissed as fragile and unremarkable. She saw something else too. Something that had carried her ancestors across oceans and over mountains, and through every disaster that had died. To end them, she saw a survivor. She picked up her staff and walked toward the arena where Carveth Sorm was waiting to destroy her. The Galactic Unified Academy floated in the darkness of space like a jewel made of light and metal. And Una Park stood at the observation window, watching ships come and go from 100 different worlds. She had been here for 3 months now, one of only 12 humans admitted to the most prestigious institution in known space. And every single day reminded her that humanity was the newest and lowest-ranked species in galactic civilization. Humans had only made contact with the wider galaxy 5 years ago, and the other species still looked at them like curious animals who had somehow learned to speak. The tier system ranked all sentient species from 1 to 7 based on physical capabilities and evolutionary development. And humans sat firmly at the bottom as Tier 7, classified as fragile and unremarkable and barely worth noticing. Una had grown used to the stares and the whispers and the way other students stepped around. Her legs she might break if they got too close. She made her way through the carved corridors toward Combat Assessment Hall 3, where today's practical examination would take place under the watchful eyes of Professor Kelthos, a 4-armed Scythian who had never once called on a human student during his lectures. The hall was already filling with students when she arrived, and she found a spot near the back where she could watch without drawing attention to herself. Tessa stood nearby, a small Mallory whose skin glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns that shifted with her emotions. And she offered Una a nervous smile that made her face light up in shades of blue and green. The Mallory were Tier 6, only 1 step above humans. And Tessith had been kind to Una since the first day when no one else would sit with her in the dining hall. A hush fell over the room as the main doors slid open, and Una felt the temperature seem to drop as Carveth Sorn entered the combat hall. He stood 8 feet tall with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian, and his 4 arms hung at his sides with claws retracted but still visible beneath the surface of his fingertips. The Vorax were Tier 1 apex predators, the highest classification in galactic society, and Carveth was the son of a high warlord who commanded fear across 7 star systems. He had never lost a sanctioned duel in 3 years at the academy, and most students surrendered the moment he accepted their challenge. Rather than face him in the arena, Professor Kelthos began the assessment with lower-tier students, demonstrating basic defensive techniques. And Yuna watched carefully as species after species showed what evolution had granted them for survival. The Kreth could withstand incredible pressure. The Silith could change their body composition at will. And even the Mallory had bioluminescent abilities that could blind attackers in darkness. When the professor asked what humans could demonstrate, Yuna felt every eye in the room turn toward her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. She said nothing. And after a moment, the professor moved on as if she had never been there at all. The advanced demonstrations began, and Carveth took the center of the hall to show the power of a true apex predator. He moved through combat forms that made the air whistle, and his forearms worked in perfect coordination as he struck training dummies hard enough to send them flying across the room. The other students watched with admiration and fear. And even the professor seemed impressed by the raw power contained in his massive frame. Then Carveth stopped and pointed one clawed finger at Tessith, demanding that she step forward and serve as his demonstration partner for a restraint technique. The Mallory girl trembled as she walked to the center of the hall, her skin flickering with pale yellows and grays that showed her terror to everyone. Watching Carveth did not need to restrain her gently for a demonstration. And he did not. He grabbed her with two of his arms and twisted until she cried out. Then swept her legs and sent her crashing to the floor with enough force to knock the breath from her small body. When Tessith tried to rise, Carveth placed one massive foot on her back and pressed down, holding her against the cold metal floor while he addressed the class. He said that this was the natural order of the galaxy, that some species were born to dominate and others were born to submit, and that the Mallory and others like them should be grateful. They were even allowed to attend an institution meant for their betters. His eyes swept the room as he spoke, daring anyone to disagree, and every student looked away or down or anywhere except at the small glowing girl pinned beneath his foot. Yuna felt something hot and sharp building in her chest. Something that had been growing since the first day a professor ignored her question, and the first time a student laughed at humanity's tier classification. She thought about her grandmother back on Earth, who had survived a war and rebuilt her life from nothing, and her mother who had worked 3 jobs to send Yuna to the best schools, and every human who had ever faced something bigger and stronger and refused to back down. Her hand went up before she could stop it, and her voice rang out clear and steady across the silent hall. Professor Kelthos asked what she wanted with obvious irritation in his tone, and Yuna heard herself speak words that made the entire room freeze. She formally challenged Carveth Soren to a sanctioned duel under Academy law, invoking Article 12, which stated that any student could challenge any other student regardless of tier classification or species origin. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a sound like grinding metal that Yuna realized was Carveth laughing. He lifted his foot from Tessith and turned to face the human girl who stood barely as tall as his chest, and his golden eyes examined her like she was an insect that had suddenly begun to speak. He accepted the challenge with amusement dripping from every word, and he suggested the duel take place in 7 days so that she would have time to write full well letters to her family. Professor Kelthos tried to intervene, citing concerns about safety and the extreme mismatch in physical capabilities. But both students had spoken the formal words, and Academy law was clear on such matters. The duel was recorded in the official register, and a date was set that gave Yuna 168 hours to prepare for what everyone assumed would be her death. The class ended in chaos as students rushed to spread the news, and within an hour the entire academy would know that a human girl had raised her hand against the apex predator that everyone feared. Yuna made her way to where Tessith still floor, her bioluminescence dim and her eyes wet with tears, and she offered her hand to help the Mallory stand. Tessith took it and rose on shaking legs, then looked at Yuna with an expression of confusion and grief mixed together. She asked why Yuna would throw her life away for a stranger. Why any person would sacrifice themselves for someone they barely knew. And her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. Yuna squeezed her hand gently and gave her the only answer she had. Someone had to. She walked out of the combat hall with her head held high and her heart pounding against her ribs. And she did not let herself shake until she was alone in her quarters with the door sealed behind her. 7 days, she thought as she stared at her reflection in the dark window. 7 days to find a way to survive the unsurvivable. 7 days to show the galaxy what humans were really made of.